Hello and welcome to the Unusual Stories podcast. My name is Wojciech Salski. I'll be your host for today as per usual. And before we start, may I just remind you, if you like this podcast in any way, if you find it entertaining, supportive, useful, maybe in a way of whatever reason you find to listen to it and enjoy it, then please make sure to click a follow button, maybe subscribe to either my channel on your podcast slash music app, or maybe on my channel on YouTube. As well, feel free to share it with your friends. It's the best kind of advertisement there is. And I cannot stress this enough, support of my friends, of which I will tell in a moment as well, has really proven me again and again over my life as the best way of promoting yourself out there. So obviously, if you think this is something worthwhile, then make sure to share it with others. And if you'd like to support my work in any way, please follow the link below. As well, a fun, interesting thing that I will be advertising more in the weeks to come is I've just published my second book. So this one here is my first one from the 3 years ago, and now the second one is already on Amazon as well. I've had a very successful launch date yesterday. Actually, it was the 25th of April, Thursday, and we've managed to hit some really great sort of category streaks on Amazon just by people downloading the book and purchasing it. And because of it, to celebrate it, and since you are here listening, I would like to extend my warm welcome and gratitude to you for your support and offer you a download for free of that book. So right now it's already all purchasable. But for this exclusive moment, and I think I will keep it up for another 2 weeks or so, whoever encounters this episode in particular, and maybe I'll do one more, and would like to get a free copy of the book, can sign up on my link below onto getting the free copy sample. So just put your email address in there. It's on my link tree. It says get your free copy now or something like that. And I will send it to you just as a little exclusive thing, an extending hand, let's say. And before I start as well with our episode, I just wanted to mention this. I found it amazing how a support of a bunch of people out there that wish me well over the course of 3 days can make my book jump from something like 300,000 place in Amazon's categories onto the first 10. So the record is the 5th place in Poland, and I think in UK it's somewhere around 70th place. So obviously not so high, but I understandably I have many more close allies in Poland than I do in UK for obvious reasons. I've lived there twice as long as I lived here, so it makes sense that way. But yeah, it's just amazing, guys. And I will actually do a separate episode about the book itself once it arrives. For the time being, as I said, if you'd like to get one of those copies yourself, either buy it online on Amazon or reach out to me on my link tree and I will send it over to you. So without further ado, let's start. Today's episode is about the book by Joseph Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And to be honest, guys, it's not an easy book. As much as Maps of Meaning, which is over here, is also not an easy book. So this is one of the reasons really why I've decided to talk about this book in particular, especially for your own benefit, because I can imagine this kind of a read to be quite heavy for many people. And if you're not passionate about the things such as mythology, religion, storytelling, and understanding such concepts in a more sort of broader, more in-depth as well as broader space, you might find this book just too heavy to deal with. And since I'm a storyteller, or at least I claim to be so. I do believe that we manifest what we are and what we do in life by doing it. So I'm trying to be a storyteller, let's say, similarly to telling you those stories throughout my podcasts. I found this book quite interesting and definitely eye-opening in many ways in terms of understanding mythology more and observing as well through this book's perspective which myths and which maybe societal issues may we be dealing with today because we've forgotten some of those myths. So maybe just a little breakdown or an introduction what the book is about. If you've never heard about the book before, it's basically a discussion of theory, of mythological structure, of the journey of the archetypal hero found in the world of myths. So it's a mouthful, I know, but for the most part, the book is basically taking apart a bunch of myths that you might know or not know, but they're very deeply engraved in our religions and our societal cultural norms, especially in the West, because many of them are based on the Greek mythology to start with, as well as some fairy tales and some pagan myths of the of European descent. And Joseph Campbell, who's probably one of the most powerful names out there in the past when it comes to storytelling and taking storytelling apart, is analyzing myths and offering us an insight into what those myths mean and basically how we can use understanding them to our advantage, especially as storytellers. So I've taken a note here. Why would you want to read this book? And maybe this is also a good note for you right now, my dear listener, whether or not you would even consider listening to this podcast further. Maybe this is not the one for you. If you're interested in mythology, if you're interested in religion, or if you're interested in storytelling or understanding how these ancient stories that we've been telling each other for generations have affected our psyche, this is definitely a book for you. And I would advise you to take a chance on it and listen to it or read it. Similarly to Maps of Meaning, which I think is inspired in great depth by the work of Joseph Campbell as well as Carl Jung. It's not an easy read yet again, but it may be just a necessary one for you if you're interested in those areas to begin with. And if you'd like to explore the episode about Maps of Meaning, which is a very popular episode apparently among my listeners, then I'll put the link below for it as well. So let's start. First of all, the one thing that really made an impression on me in this book in particular is this idea of looking back where we've come from as a civilization, as a species, the way we understood the world before science was developed. And I'll come back to science in a bit in more detail. But the book itself starts off with a few myths and with the major theme being sort of looking back at where we come from and basically what gods meant for us before we've established a full-blown civilization and sort of a social structure. So obviously, I mean, as long as you do believe in evolution, although I don't know if that's a good thing to believe in, it's rather something that is potentially obvious for us to be a part of our existence. Anyhow, we've been much more connected to plants and animals in the past because we were, and still are, but definitely back then, a part of that ecosystem more. We were not above it. We were barely scraping the surface of, sort of managing it. Nowadays, humans are very overwhelming in terms of the way we deal with the planet and with other animals around us, right? We are much more in control than we used to be. So when we used to live in tribes and when we used to be a part of this ecosystem instead of being sort of above it, the one interesting thing that we should always look back on is the fact that both animals and plants and the environment around us was much more godly and sort of saint to us. So in pretty much any religion and any culture out there in the past, animals were saintly, and there were either gods created in the image of animals or in the image of some plants. You know, many pagan traditions involved having a sacred tree or a sacred burial ground, sacred space, maybe some kind of an Eden garden, so to speak. Similarly, if you know anything about the tradition and culture of ancient Egypt, all the gods were, portrayed as animal hybrids with men, sort of having a head of an animal and the body of a human. And many of the animalistic features as well as the plant-like features were involved when talking about faith and religion-based traditions. So either in ancient Sumer, in ancient China, and in ancient Egypt, for example, there were big influences of this tradition being one with nature. And this is really the emphasis I wanted to put here, something that really touched me as something well observed and interesting, that before we've managed as a species to go beyond being a part of this ecosystem, we've had much more respect, it seems to me, and much more appreciation, maybe a bit of awe, to the world of animals, plants, and environment as a whole around us. And then when social order has been introduced more and more, especially over the agricultural revolution, when we've sort of tamed a limited but still a number of species of plants and animals to become our sort of workers / slaves, we've also become a slave more and more to this idea that we are like gods. And suddenly, especially nowadays, if you think about it, the majority of faith that is proposed and pronounced throughout the world seems to be much more oriented towards a god like a human rather than a god like an animal or a plant. So, for example, in Christianity, it seems to me that I'm invited to believe there is a God out there, obviously much more potent and able than I am, but we are made in the image of God, right? So suddenly this puts humans at the center of attention when it comes to sort of observing how should we act. And, it does make you wonder, how did this affect our arrogance and our proneness for failing to recognize that we're just a part of this world. We are a part of it rather than above it. It might have been, at least from the perspective of Joseph Campbell's book, and also from my perspective after reading it, it seems to me that maybe we've grown so arrogant and sort of big on ourselves and our social structures that we've forgotten how and where we've come from. So, yeah, instead of having much respect and recognition for the animals and plants, we've grown to love ourselves more and more. And of course, there are benefits to it as well as sort of shortcomings. So yeah, that's an interesting thing, and I don't want to go deeper into it because obviously, if you like to explore the book, then there is plenty more on that in that regard to explore for yourself. Secondly, I think an interesting thing that Joseph Campbell's book pointed out to me is the fact of forgetting a certain a certain number of ideas and concepts to our peril. So I actually took note here of a bunch of them, and I'll read them out first and then I'll sort of elaborate on them. First of all, we focused on ourselves so much, we barely remember where we've come from, as I've mentioned earlier, and instead of understanding our similarities, we've come to focus on differences more and more, which has led to conflict. And I think this builds on this idea that was just proposed a moment ago, that because we've grown to focus on ourselves more and more, it's much more difficult to recognize similarities with others if you're looking at yourself all of the time, right? It's a sort of this idea of forgetting the forest for the trees. If you focus so much on details, you might forget the bigger picture. And I think this is where the humility of the tribes before we've established those social structures that allowed us to grow our civilization and become much more gods on this planet than we were before, we've forgotten or maybe not all of this, and I don't want to take away from your humility, with all due respect, and I hope I'm also humble enough to still not be thinking of myself as a god. But this idea here, this reminder by Joseph Campbell that instead of looking at similarities and connecting with others, it is much more easy to find differences with others when you focus on yourself so much. And this is an interesting thing to think about, right? And a good invitation, I would say, as well from the outer, to recognize whenever we are just a little bit over the top with egoism and self-centeredness. That's a mouthful. So this forgetting it to our peril, meaning so much conflict these days, and you don't have to look far to see conflict in the world, and it breaks my heart whenever I actually do go online to check the news, although I do it very sporadically and from a very limited amount of sources, just because for my own sake I don't want to put too much negativity into my head. And I'm encouraging you to do the same. It's good to be informed, but it's not great to dwell on misery too much, I think. But there is so much conflict in the world, and there are so many reasons to find ourselves arguing and discrediting other people and other ideas, that maybe to a certain degree what we need is a reminder that we all come from the same source and we all are a part of this world in the same way. We are all equal in this world, whether you believe that there is God or not. That's slightly, in my opinion, irrelevant. You can still be a humble and loving to others person without the belief in God or without the belief in a greater structure. Because, even if you abandon all of that faith, let's say, you do still have the ability to recognize you're a part of the world, which is definitely much bigger, with all due respect, than your ego is. And this is probably the illusion of ego that so many of faith and religion-based traditions try to remind us of. So that was an interesting part of the book, which wasn't an obvious one to begin with, because if you pick up the book from a shelf, it's going to probably talk about myths a lot. And you might think that this is a kind of book that introduces myths so you can understand them more. But through those myths, Joseph Campbell touches on very essential aspects of our existence. And I found it very profound as an exploration of those ideas. Now, off to science. And this is a very interesting part, which I found very insightful. So I don't know how much you know about the part of magic playing a role in our past, but truly, before science really took hold of our societies as at large, for the most part, instead of science, there used to be magic, right? There used to be a certain number of sort of druids and kind of knowing people on courts of Caesars and on courts of different leaders and tribes in the past. And there used to be traditions which are still held in some smaller circles these days, because certainly science has become more contemporary than alternative, as they call it nowadays, ways of medicine or ways of spirituality, ways of being. There used to be those traditions that nowadays we would call magic, whereas back then, it doesn't really matter what they were called, they were certainly perceived at least as reasonable or as relevant as science is these days. And that's an interesting thing to note, because, first of all, and this might come as a bit of an insult maybe, although I wouldn't want you to feel that way. People in the past, whether it was ancient Greeks or ancient Sumerians or ancient Egyptians or any other ancient, tribes and so on, they were not necessarily more stupid than we are. Their intelligence might have been just placed in different aspects of being. And this is really something to consider, because in terms of our humility, we fall short, in my perception, whenever we consider the past, thinking that people in the past must have been stupid because of X, Y, Z, whether because they didn't have insurance policies, whether because they didn't have technology that allowed them to connect with one another across the globe within seconds, whether or not they allowed themselves to be living in a hut out in the mud instead of having a skyscraper built for them. And it's very easy to fall prey to this idea of our ego that we are somehow better in the essential form than those before us. And of course, technologically, one could argue that we've outrun all the others, and it makes sense, right? We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. So obviously we have progressed in many ways technologically, especially over millennia. But in terms of intelligence and in terms of understanding and the different layers of understanding, I would say it's a very arrogant claim to say that we are in any way better than those before us. And so here, this idea of magic being discredited these days because science is all-knowing is in the least arrogant, because whatever works for you is relevant, right? If you have a certain way of doing something that brings the results you wish for yourself from that activity, I would say that is relevant and that is true, whatever that might be. So discrediting it just because it's not your cup of tea or it's not your way of doing things that someone else does doesn't hold. By the fruits they bear, you will know them, right? As the scripture says. And I think this is really, really powerful and interesting, important to remind yourself of, that this individual focus, which has overcome the world focus, and the science, which has overcome the magic, the tradition, is all great and fine, but in a way, it's narrowing our view. And now I have this little note I've taken here, that it's depth over width in a way. Because if you think about it, what science does is it either looks really, really deeply into something, for example, by a magnifying glass, or it looks really, really far into something, for example, a telescope. But if you look at it from a bigger picture perspective, both of those actions actually look closer by narrowing the view. And I don't want to discredit it. Like, there are so many amazing, wonderful designs and things that have come from this kind of activity, but not looking into things on the whole, because we've, dissected everything into little particles, we might miss out on some essential aspects of our reality. And for example, like, I feel like bringing up here the idea of medicine, contemporary medicine has dealt a huge blow to this alternative, or a holistic nowadays called medicine, because instead of trying to heal a person on the whole, we've specialized in healing each little part of the body. And there are benefits to both, in my opinion. On one hand, a great part of specializing in one little particular aspect of one's health is useful, because you can go really in depth into that part. But then, since our body works as a whole, it has a certain value to understand how it is all interlinked. And as I said, this is a huge topic maybe to dive into on its own, but by magnifying or looking through a telescope, we cannot forget to look at it as a bigger picture at the same time. And here, a great quote that I've taken out of the book is, "It is within ourselves that the greatest challenge and battle has to be taken place." And this is at the part of the book where Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey sort of tying up into this climax kind of moment, when they're having to deal with their own greatest weaknesses. And this is where the traditions, of the past, many of them from all kinds of spaces in the world and time, invite us to first and foremost conquer ourselves. And within ourselves, we must conquer fear or prejudice or some kind of anger and resentment and weakness and bitterness. It is within ourselves that we must first conquer evil, so we can be good and free of it. So, looking back into science and magic, it is within ourselves ultimately, at least from this point of view, to reconcile the relationship between the two and allow ourselves to be open-minded for both, because both can benefit us greatly. And this actually calls for another episode in itself, but the way I see it, there is no greater way of approaching life than by studying its little pieces, but using them to create the bigger jigsaw puzzle for ourselves. And that's my invitation to you at this point. That's Yeah, that's bearing responsibility on your own and dealing with the world as it presents itself to you. And I've just taken a note here that it's every one of us that can become the hero by taking up our cross. And, this is the invitation, obviously, from Christianity in particular, but many other traditions point to this, that by taking on the responsibility of dealing with the world and really looking at it with a fresh eye and really looking straight into the face of your fears and your weaknesses, you will find salvation for yourself in a way of reconciling this world, becoming better because of it and within it. And this is what the hero with 1,000 faces invites us to do. Ultimately, I think it's a very spiritual, even though it might not seem like spiritual, book. And now finally, I just have a quick note here on good and evil, because I found that very, very relevant. So I don't know if you remember a quote from Gulag Archipelago. I'm actually reading this book right now. It's very heavy, and I will take some time before I deliver it to you, I think another few weeks at least. And in Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes that the border between good and evil lies in the middle of everyone's heart. And this idea that it is within ourselves where evil and good has to fight, this idea of two wolves and which one you feed wins, has very profoundly impacted the way I perceived the book by Joseph Campbell as well. And there are moments in the book when he's analyzing the parts of hero's journey where the hero has to either become evil or overcome his weakness and sort of risk losing himself on the altar of staying good. And I do believe that this is something as essential as life itself in our existence. And as much as it might not sound too optimistic, I do believe that all of us at some point in our lives have to deal with choices that either make or break our ability to be good and true to ourselves and to whatever we stand for. And a good optimistic touch here, I guess, is, in my opinion, it is up to us to be all we can be. So, at this point, I will leave you with an invitation. Of course, I don't want to put too much strain on you, so if you would like to read the book and let me know what you like about it afterwards, please do so. I will put in below a link to this book on Amazon, and I've personally listened to it. I found it very, very entertaining and useful. And the invitation for this week for you to consider, inspired by the book, is to look over your beliefs, traditions, or myths or your culture or your family has dealt with that you might be, interested in, or you found it impactful on yourself. And consider, how do they, or does it, affect the way you perceive or behave in the world? And whether or not this is the kind of thing that you would like to, or would like a hero to act or behave like. And it may not be too easy, Looking into your own traditions is difficult because we take them so obviously for granted, then we forget why even we do them. The same way as, there are some stories about people having a very weird tradition about, for example, cutting a ham in half when they're putting it into the oven. And after some deliberation, it turns out that just grandma a while back had a very tiny oven, and she used to cut it in half for that reason. Whereas a couple of generations down, people are still doing it, not knowing why, just because it was told them to do, or they observed it to be done that way. And so my invitation here is to recognize in your spiritual, religious, traditional, cultural life whether there are some ways of being that you might not understand the reasons for. And if there are, then I would invite you to understand those reasons and reconcile for yourself whether or not you do still believe them to be true and relevant. Because that's where the power comes from. That's where agency of being yourself comes from. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on board yet again. I hope this episode and this book you find interesting and insightful. As I said before, yet again, if you're still out there and you would like the new book for yourself, please click the link below. Either purchase the book on your own or send me, subscribe to get your own copy. I will be happy to do it as an exclusive option for you. So yeah, have a wonderful week. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.